Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. In this next hour here, we're going to spend some time looking at a couple of issues in the news, starting off, of course, with a salute to Senator John McCain. Then in the next hour, Jack Alexander will be with us by phone. We're going to talk about his new book, The God Impulse. You might remember we've had him on before talking about finances and our financial stewardship. This one really gets into the issue of mercy and some other topics that I think you will find very helpful in terms of your own Christian growth and life. And then in the third hour, we'll have in studio with us Kurt Nelson and Steve Smith by phone. They're with East-West Ministries. And if you are not familiar with that, you probably could listen to some of the other interviews. We've had John Mazel on the program with us before. He was the founder of East-West Ministries. We had Mario Zanstra with us, who is now with a different ministry, but was in studio with us talking about this. And then even while I was out one time, I think we had a conversation, and Dr. Merrill Matthews had him in studio with Tommy Nelson. So we're going to certainly get back into some of that as well. Let's, if we can, focus a little bit of time and attention on John McCain. And the first article we've posted here comes from the Wall Street Journal, which I thought did a fairly good job of, in a short amount of space, as editorials often are, summarizing an individual's life, and talked about some of the reasons why over the years we've had some questions about him, and also how the media has treated him. He, for some time, was really kind of the darling of the mainstream media. There was a joke that I made more than once when we would talk about John McCain. I would, if we were talking about McCain-Feingold, I'd say, Senator Feingold represents the state of Wisconsin. Senator McCain represents the mainstream media. And it would always get a laugh, but we knew what we meant by it, and that is he was so loved by the media, in part because he was somewhat of a maverick in the Republican Party. For a long time, he was kind of critical of certain things that were done by George W. Bush. But then all of a sudden, it turned almost overnight when it began to be obvious to everybody in the media that this is the Republican nominee and that he's going to run against, and at that time they didn't know for sure whether it was going to be Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama. As it unfolded, it was obviously Barack Obama. And so then I think no one was more surprised than he was that all of a sudden a man that was getting all sorts of attention and all sorts of accolades now was being vilified and criticized and all sorts of things. And then, of course, when he picked Sarah Palin, then it just completely unloaded on John McCain. And, of course, if there had not been the 2008 economic downturn, there were times when it was quite likely that he would have been the president of the United States. And that, of course, never happened. And, of course, he served in the Senate until recently. But anyway, that all as background. The piece from the Wall Street Journal said that when John McCain was shot down over Hanoi in October of 1967, he was near death. His leg, both arms, and left shoulder were broken. Some of his fellow POWs didn't think he'd make it. But the Naval Academy grad beat the odds then and continued to do so until Saturday when he finally succumbed to brain cancer at age 81. McCain's calling card was honor and character. When he was fished out of that lake in downtown Hanoi, the North Vietnamese first withheld treatment until they discovered his father was an admiral and a commander of naval forces in Europe. The late great Admiral James Stockdale, who was tortured in that prison, said McCain received an offer that, as far as I know, was made to no other American prisoner: immediate release, no strings attached. The young pilot told the Vietnamese what they could do with their special treatment, effectively sentencing himself to 4 more years of beatings. This reflected his profound sense of duty. In the Hanoi Hilton, he and his fellow POWs resisted the enemy despite torture and returned with honor. We could end there because certainly there are individuals that never went into political office. But, of course, we have our own Sam Johnson, who is now stepping down, Congressman Sam Johnson, and, of course, Senator John McCain as two of many individuals we can point to who, after their service in Vietnam, went on to political life. But, nevertheless, there is a lot more to say about that because, as they say in the Wall Street Journal, McCain stayed in the Navy after returning home until he retired in 1981 to pursue a political career. In 1982, he was elected to Congress from his new home in Arizona. 4 years later, he won a Senate seat he would hold until his death. By the way, I might just mention that in 1986, John McCain ended up in a situation that was kind of strange because in 1980 to 1986, there was a slim Republican majority, which was certainly very helpful to then President Ronald Reagan. But then in 1986, the Republicans lost some key seats. So John McCain came in a sense, being part of the minority party rather than the majority party in the Senate. And for many years, of course, maybe actually cut his teeth on not necessarily ruling, but having to work with the ruling party. And that is something I'll get back to in just a few minutes. But nevertheless, Wall Street Journal said that in the Senate, his politics were generally conservative, but more personal than ideological. His abiding priority was men and women in uniform. McCain was determined that when America sent its soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines into harm's way, they would have what they needed to prevail, including the moral support of their representatives. And he wasn't afraid of sacred cows. McCain spoke loudly and honestly about ethanol subsidies, knowing that it would cost him in the Iowa primaries if he ever ran for president. McCain's preoccupation with personal honor did not always serve him well. He was tarred by the Keating 5 scandal in 1989 when he and 4 other senators were accused of improperly intervening with regulators on behalf of the Lincoln Savings and Loan run by Charles Keating, who had been a campaign contributor. McCain was the least culpable, having been dragged in by the others, but he was scarred by the event and devoted the rest of his career to rehabilitating his name by promoting campaign finance reforms that in theory take money out of politics, but in practice dent the First Amendment. I'm going to take a break. When we come back, I want to talk about that particular aspect, because when you look at the career of John McCain, you have to recognize that sometimes he would take on issues that you wouldn't necessarily identify with a conservative Republican, and part of that has to do with some of his own experience. One of those, of course, was this issue of the Keating 5. Now, some of you may be young enough to say, I have no idea what you're talking about. Well, just recognize that it was one of those banking scandals, and if you're younger, you might think of some of the banking scandals of 2008, because you probably, unless you're really young, can at least remember those. Well, back in 1989, that was one of those scandals, and he really wasn't, as they, I think, aptly point out, that involved. But every once in a while, when you would have somebody talk about Senator John McCain, there was this mention of the Keating 5 scandal. And I think over time, it wore on him so much that that's why you eventually have things like campaign finance reform, the so-called McCain-Feingold Act, and even later why he tried to continue to reach across the aisle to establish some kind of comprehensive immigration reform. So we're going to come back and spend just another minute or two on John McCain, who oftentimes was even referred to by, I think his grandmother, as a scamp, but he always loved the term maverick. And I guess if you're a flight pilot, being called maverick is a good thing. So we'll talk about his maverick tendencies right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
recent Gallup poll shows that a majority of Democrats view socialism favorably compared to a new low of Democrats who view capitalism favorably. To put this in perspective, just a few years ago, a majority of Democrats viewed capitalism favorably. Meanwhile, more than 7 in 10 of Republicans have had a favorable view of capitalism during that same period of time. The Gallup poll was quick to acknowledge that their poll does not define socialism or capitalism. As I've mentioned in previous commentaries and even in my latest book, Christians in Economics, this might explain some of the lower percentages. The term capitalism has often been degraded in the popular culture. The Gallup poll also believes that it is possible that a drop in Democrats' positive views of capitalism is related to Donald Trump's presidency. After all, Trump has been described as a free market capitalist. If you dislike Trump, then you're likely to also dislike capitalism. One last reason for the change can be linked to the prominence of socialists within the Democrat Party. Senator Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have been traveling the country speaking to crowds and endorsing candidates. Some of the proposals by Sanders that used to be on the margin of the Democratic Party are now becoming mainstream. Democratic socialists like to point to Sweden and Denmark as socialist success stories, but these countries are not technically socialist. And as I've discussed in previous commentaries, the success of these countries depended on a capitalist foundation long before the significant expansion of social programs. The Gallup poll announced that this was the first time Democrats viewed socialism more favorably than capitalism. This will affect how they vote in these midterm elections. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, thought we'd spend just a few more minutes talking about John McCain, then move on to what is going to be front and center here in the next couple of weeks, and that is the confirmation hearings for the nominee to the Supreme Court, which is Brett Kavanaugh. And one of the articles I've posted here by George Will, some constitutional questions worth asking Kavanaugh. But before we finish off here, let's give, again, Senator John McCain his due. And one of the things they say in the Wall Street Journal is over time he adopted the media's label as a maverick. And he never really rejected that. Matter of fact, kind of embraced it, if nothing else. Think about, of course, if you think about Top Gun, guess who Maverick was? You know, it's Tom Cruise. So that was a nickname that he actually endorsed. And then in 2000, when he ran for the presidency and essentially running against George W. Bush, he even named his presidential campaign bus the Straight Talk Express. But as, again, the Wall Street Journal said, while he often referred to the media as his base, that goes back to some of the comments I made just a minute ago, with only partial irony, his positions put him at odds with many of his own party and cost him the nomination against George W. Bush. Well, often what happens is an individual that is runner-up in one presidential campaign later becomes the presumptive nominee in the next, and that is certainly what took place there. And that is he tried again and won in 2008, but as they point out, the worst possible moment for a Republican amid a financial crisis, a long and unpopular war in the Middle East, as well as attractive African-American on the Democratic ticket. The same media that praised his anti-Republican positions abandoned him against Barack Obama, citing his choice of Sarah Palin as a running mate as an excuse. Now, again, I appreciate the fact that the Wall Street Journal points out how much more intense the criticism was of John McCain after selecting Sarah Palin, but recognize that did not happen till the summer. It was pretty obvious by the late spring, really almost the mid-spring, that John McCain was already the nominee, and you could see the press had already turned against him then. So that, of course, was, as they point out, merely an excuse, but just one more reason to embrace Barack Obama and to reject John McCain. And then there were even meetings. I remember one very significant meeting in September where you had both John McCain and you had Barack Obama. And John McCain, a senior senator with lots of experience, was given short shrift, in part because of the way the game was played. And this incoming senator, Barack Obama, who quite frankly probably didn't know a whole lot about the banking industry or anything else, sort of just took over the meeting, and that just established him all the more as an individual worth actually electing to the presidency. And, of course, if there had been a different set of circumstances, maybe John McCain running against Hillary Clinton or some other variables, we might be talking about the death of a former president, John McCain, but nevertheless, that was it. So in the last decade, they point out, John McCain continued to advocate for a stronger military, continuing U.S. leadership against the advancing authoritarians in Russia, China, and the Middle East. But his vote against reforming Obamacare and Medicare contradicted his support for the military. And without reforms, entitlements will grow, they say, and inevitably squeeze military spending to European levels. The Wall Street Journal ends by saying most important to McCain's view of politics was his devout patriotism and ultimately faith in the American exceptionalism. Hailing to the service as his grandfather and father in his own in Vietnam, McCain believed in the rightness of American purposes around the world. This belief caused him in the final years to resist the drift in his own party towards isolationism. This was a principal root of his differences with Donald Trump. When McCain received his brain cancer diagnosis, his daughter called him a warrior at dusk. It's an apt description. While the searing experience of Vietnam led so many to lose their faith in America's goodness, for John McCain, it was just the opposite. He said, "I fell in love with my country when I was a prisoner in someone else's." You know, we wish more people would hold to his kind of patriotism. It is, I think, a little bit ironic, dare I even use the word hypocritical, about those in the press today that are saluting him for his heroism and his patriotism at a time when these are the same individuals that are saluting those individuals that actually are critical of our country and can't even stand for the Pledge of Allegiance or the Star-Spangled Banner or a number of other things. But nevertheless, an individual that we will miss in one sense, but also will create an interesting set of situations now when you talk about the vote for Brett Kavanaugh. You have one senator in Arizona stepping down. You have the other senator who actually has now died. And so the governor will be able to appoint an individual, and there are all sorts of possible nominees. One is to go back to a previous senator. That's one person that's been talked about. Another is an attorney general. But it is, I think, all the more interesting in light of the fact that in order for Brett Kavanaugh to be confirmed, you, of course, still need 50 votes, really 51. And at the moment, you don't have 51 Republican senators. You don't really have 50 if you want to get right down to the technical reality of it all. And so who that individual from Arizona is put in that position and whether or not that individual is accepted as a voting member will also affect what I think is going to be front and center here in about a week, and that is the confirmation hearings for Judge Brett Kavanaugh as the next individual to serve on the Supreme Court. And recognize the Supreme Court convenes the first Monday in October, so that's coming very quickly. Which is why I wanted to get to my next piece, which we'll start with and then continue through the break, after the break, and that is George Will has a number of constitutional questions that are worth asking of Judge Brett Kavanaugh. He says Senate Republicans and Democrats are at daggers drawn over the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. Instead, they should unsheath some questions designed to illuminate the excitement of constitutional reasoning. The Constitution, he says, vests in Congress the power to tax. Presidents, however, are unilaterally imposing taxes, i.e. tariffs. That would be, of course, President Trump, because Congress has delegated to presidents vast discretion in imposing protectionism. Should the court protect the separation of powers by enforcing on Congress a non-delegation doctrine? That is a really good question. As I pointed out in one of my previous viewpoint commentaries, one of the things that some of these Republican candidates might want to do is to say, you know, there was a time in which Congress was the one that dealt with tariffs, and so we believe that Congress should take this back. And so if somebody says, well, wait a minute, if you're supporting Donald Trump, if you're a Republican and Donald Trump's a Republican, that means you support tariffs. You can say, no, I don't support the tariffs, and I don't believe that the president should have that authority because Congress should exercise that. But that would be a very good question for Judge Brett Kavanaugh. So first of all, that issue of tariffs. Let's take a different one. In a 1905 case, the court struck down a state law limiting bakers' work hours because it infringed on worker and employees' liberty interest in making consensual contracts. Assuming, as is patent, this law was rent-seeking by unionized bakers and bakeries, that it was written to protect their interest, not public health, was that decided carefully and decided correctly? So again, that'd be another kind of question that might be a little bit inside the weeds or inside baseball, but would be interesting, because the dissent in that very famous case by Oliver Wendell Holmes said that the Constitution does not enact the idea of social statics, a book advocating laissez-faire economic policies. However, because laissez-faire is what freedom looks like in economic life, is there some sense in which the Constitution, the purpose of which is to enable a free society, does foster it? Here's another question. In 1958, the court invalidated as an infringement of freedom of association an Alabama law targeting the NAACP by requiring disclosure of organizationals' membership lists. The court said anonymity was necessary to shield the supporters from dangers. Given today's instances of individuals injured because of their political affiliations, are mandatory disclosure laws problematic? You might say, well, that's, again, in the weeds. No, it's not. Recognize that when we find out that an individual, for example, gave to a particular campaign, or in the case of California, an individual that supported the idea that an amendment that would say that marriage is between a man and a woman could actually lose his or her job, or in some cases where individuals that are members of a particular organization have been fired, it's a good question as to whether or not forcing people to disclose membership lists, is that part of freedom, or should people have privacy? So you can begin to see that George Will's really asking some good questions. Sadly, I don't know how many senators are going to ask them, but maybe they will. And that's why I've posted that article on our website, so you can see the kind of issues which we may have to address in the future in the Supreme Court. We'll be right back.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands, and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again. In the next hour, we're going to have Jack Alexander with us, the new book, The God Impulse, which deals with mercy. And in September, we had a chance to talk with him about his book, God Guarantee. And again, that one had to do with finances and a number of other issues. So if you'd like to join our conversation today, 1-800-351-1212, or just sit back and listen, because I think George Will is raising some really good questions. Sometimes, as is wont for an individual with his academic background, it's a little hard to follow, but The point he was making a minute ago that I was explaining is that we have these laws that now make kind of mandatory disclosure of individuals who are members, which means if you join an organization, those membership lists can be made public. And when they're made public, in the old days, there was a concern about that because, say, if you were a member of the NAACP, you could be targeted by racists. Now, if you're a member of, say, the Young Republicans, or you support a particular political group, or National Right to Life, or maybe Alliance Defending Freedom, then the gay groups primarily are the ones, but not exclusively. There are others too, progressives, and sometimes even on conservative side. But by and large, I see most of the targeting coming from LGBT activists who then go after individuals when their particular name is listed in a particular organization. And if indeed the First Amendment allows for the freedom of association, and we've had so much said over so many decades about privacy. I mean, after all, the so-called right to privacy, first sort of created when we talk about contraception, then used when we talk about issues like abortion. Then it's used to justify all sorts of other things, from euthanasia to a variety of other issues. But privacy somehow doesn't apply if you decide to be a member of an organization that later gets targeted by an activist group. So I think it's a good question. Another one that he puts on the table has to do with the issue of affirmative action. Again, quoting from George Will. Are there constitutional limits on the admissions policies that public colleges and universities can use to ensure diverse student bodies? The 1978 case involved racial preferences in admissions, saying that race can be a plus factor for certain government-preferred minorities. So George Will ask a good question. Are there constitutional principles controlling decisions about which groups are to be preferred and about tailoring preferences? Because in 2003, when the court affirmed the constitutionality of racial preferences in university admissions, Sandra Day O'Connor, writing for the majority, hoped that such preferences would be unnecessary in 25 years so that they could. And so the question he's asking is, would those then be unconstitutional in 2028? Let's hope that 25 years is too long even there. Let's look at another issue, criminal justice. George Will says William Rehnquist, he at the time was the Supreme Court Justice and the Chief Justice, was an early and vehement critic of the court's 1966 Miranda decision that created the right of arrested persons to be notified of their right to counsel and their right to remain silent. He said the Constitution does not require this, which impedes effective policing. But when a 2000 year case came before the court, an opportunity to reverse Miranda, Rehnquist wrote for the majority in upholding 7-2 that Miranda has become embedded in routine police practice to the point where the warnings have become part of our national culture. While we have overruled our precedents with subsequent cases and have undermined their doctrinal underpinnings, we do not believe this has happened to the Miranda decision. And so the question might want to ask of Brett Kavanaugh, does this same reasoning apply to Roe versus Wade, which is a question I suspect is going to come up in a number of different ways. And in the Roe versus Wade decision on abortion, the court distinguished different degrees of abortion rights in 3 trimesters of pregnancy. What would be the constitutional law of abortion be if the number of months in the gestation of a human infant were a prime number, for example, 7 or 11? And I've heard George Will ask that question before, because there's really nothing magical about trimesters, which is funny because it was something that surfaced in a debate I did in Arkansas years ago. I debated an abortionist, and I said, you know, this is really kind of hypothetical, a second and third trimester, but by making those distinctions, then there have been all sorts of legal justification. And the abortionist made a big deal about the fact that I didn't know anything about medicine, but the bottom line is, or biology, there's nothing magical about trimesters. That was something which was superimposed upon that by a lot of medical journals, but isn't necessarily that right after 3 months, all of a sudden something remarkable changes because development takes place from conception to birth. But I love George Will's argument. What if the number of months were a prime number, 7 or 11? In other words, you couldn't divide him into threes or fours or halves or things like that. That was kind of interesting. Anyway, a couple more real quickly. What principles should the stare decisis, which is the idea that the things are supposed to stand by things decided? In other words, we respect a precedent. In the decision in 2005, having to do, in this particular case, known as the Kelo decision, which allowed individuals to actually take private property. The court said that government can seize property for public use of transferring it to wealthier private interest who will pay more taxes to the government. Does this precedent merit much respect? And is it pertinent that this decision was rendered 5-4? You might remember a while back on this program, we even talked about this movie that actually had to do with the woman who actually went all the way to the Supreme Court and eventually lost her house over this decision. And then later, the company, Pfizer, decided not to use the land anyway. And so just one of those interesting things. But again, a 5-4 decision. He points out another one. In 1995, the court ruled 5-4 that a state cannot limit by statute the number of terms members of the U.S. House of Representatives or Senate from the state can serve because such term limits create additional qualifications for such offices beyond those which are enumerated in the Constitution. Clarence Thomas, in his dissent, said the Constitution, which only sets minimum eligibility requirements, is silent about the state's power to set term limits, and its silence is no bar to actions by the states or people. Given the state's reserved powers affirmed by the 10th Amendment, George Will asks, they can exercise all powers that the Constitution does not withhold from them. Was Thomas correct? That's a big issue, too, because one of the things that so many of you have expressed over the years is we wish we had term limits. But when the Supreme Court ruled that a state cannot have term limits, now a state can have term limits on the governor, on the state representative, on the state senator, but government cannot have a limit on senators or representatives. But it was a 5-4 decision, and with Brett Kavanaugh, the decision could go the other way, which then could say, yes, we don't necessarily have to have a constitutional amendment to actually limit the terms of an individual running for the U.S. Senate or for the House of Representatives. The state can make that decision, and I think the argument would be a really powerful one, by the way, because, again, any power, any particular responsibility or power not enumerated and specifically delegated to the federal government is what? Reserved for the states and the people. And finally, one more. He says to serve the government's interest in a healthy workforce and its interest in minimizing the substantial effect of health care costs on the nation's commercial viability and vitality, could Congress, under the power of interstate commerce, require people to eat their broccoli? If not, what limiting constitutional principle exists in the Commerce Clause? That was a question that he's asked before, and others have asked as well, because it really gets back to the issue of Obamacare. The Commerce Clause has been able to justify just about any kind of action on the part of the federal government, and so he always loves to use the example of broccoli, but we can use lima beans or anything else in the illustration to say that we have a belief that has been promulgated by many liberals in Congress and by many members of the Supreme Court, that the Supreme Court and the Congress give to the federal government a lot more authority than the framers would have ever allowed. And, of course, his joke about broccoli is an attempt to bring a smile on a very serious issue. And so those are some questions that maybe Judge Brett Kavanaugh will be asked. Sadly, I fear that they will not. And those are the ones that are most important because they're the ones that are going to affect you and your family, your faith, your family, and your freedom. Let's take a break. When we come back, we've been talking about the Senate. I want to focus a little bit of time on the House. Is it possible Democrats will control the House? And if so, who will be the next Speaker of the House? We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A recent Gallup poll shows that a majority of Democrats view socialism favorably compared to a new low of Democrats who view capitalism favorably. To put this in perspective, just a few years ago, a majority of Democrats viewed capitalism favorably. Meanwhile, more than 7 in 10 of Republicans have had a favorable view of capitalism during that same period of time. The Gallup poll was quick to acknowledge that their poll does not define socialism or capitalism. As I've mentioned in previous commentaries and even in my latest book, Christians in Economics, this might explain some of the lower percentages. The term capitalism has often been degraded in the popular culture. The Gallup poll also believes that it is possible that a drop in Democrats' positive views of capitalism is related to Donald Trump's presidency. After all, Trump has been described as a free market capitalist. If you dislike Trump, then you're likely to also dislike capitalism. One last reason for the change can be linked to the prominence of socialists within the Democrat Party. Senator Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have been traveling the country speaking to crowds and endorsing candidates. Some of the proposals by Sanders that used to be on the margin of the Democratic Party are now becoming mainstream. Democratic socialists like to point to Sweden and Denmark as socialist success stories, but these countries are not technically socialist. And as I've discussed in previous commentaries, the success of these countries depended on a capitalist foundation long before the significant expansion of social programs. The Gallup poll announced that this was the first time Democrats viewed socialism more favorably than capitalism. This will affect how they vote in these midterm elections. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and one of the things we try to do is post a number of articles. First of all, of course, we posted this salute to John McCain, came from the Wall Street Journal, posted this particular set of questions worth asking of Brett Kavanaugh. And then I thought I would focus a little bit of time and attention on what is happening in the House of Representatives. And I recognize some of those questions for Brett Kavanaugh maybe were a little too academic. George Will being an individual with a PhD, probably the best educated individual that writes a column. I'm going to see if maybe I can find a way to simplify and summarize some of that, because these really are questions that should be asked of Judge Kavanaugh. And next week, I got a feeling we're not going to hear very many of them, but we may put some on the table. But let's move from the Senate, where there's going to be a lot of attention on the confirmation hearings, to the House. And we've also posted a piece here called Nancy Pelosi's Iron Grip on House Democrats, written by Jim Garrity. And he says, make no mistake, if Democrats win a majority in the House of Representatives this fall, it will be extremely likely that Nancy Pelosi will become Speaker again. Now, if you've heard me talk about this, I pointed out I'll say that Nancy Pelosi will be the Speaker or someone else. But even after reading this piece, I'm just going to say Nancy Pelosi will probably be the Speaker, because he points out something very interesting. He says, first of all, not only is there a lack of consensus among Democrats about an alternative candidate for Speaker, but Pelosi herself is pledging to crush any opposition, and she dismisses the 57 House Democratic incumbents and challengers who are currently pledging to support someone else. And she just says that's just mere politics. And I think you have to understand that if you think about this, even though she will be almost 80 years of age by the time she would become Speaker of the House in January, nevertheless, who is going to replace her? Well, you have a couple of possibilities. You have Steny Hoyer, who, maybe has expressed some interest in running, and Jim Clyburn. But think about this. You're replacing, if the age is an issue, Nancy Pelosi, who's 78, with Steny Hoyer, who's 79, or Nancy Pelosi, who's 78, with Jim Clyburn, who's 78. It's really not a generational change. So if that's what these Democratic incumbents and challengers want, they're not going to get anything. And interesting enough, 57 Democratic incumbents or challengers pledging to support someone else sounds like a lot until you remember that Nancy Pelosi beat Ohio Democrat Tim Ryan 134-61 after the 2016 election. Anti-Pelosi sentiment among Democrats is probably leveling off, not rising, he says. Now, the question, of course, that precedes all of this is, do the Democrats win the House of Representatives? If you listen to this program over the last week or so, you've heard me say I think that's a good possibility. But again, Jim Garrity puts it this way. Democrats will need at least 218 seats to take control of the House of Representatives. So looking at the projection that we published on our website, pointofview.net, you can go back to a week ago last Friday. We published this from the group 538.com. Their estimate would be that Democrats would win 228 seats. In other words, they'd have 10 more than they would need. Not all of those 57 anti-Pelosi Democrats will win, but again, Jim Garrity does some math and says, well, let's assume 9 out of 10 do. That gives you 51 of the 228 Democrats pushing for someone else, and 177 House Democrats comfortable with putting Nancy Pelosi back into the Speaker's chair. You see where the numbers work? And so unless she has a health reversal, there's a big scandal or something like that, I think it's really worth talking about Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House. Now, the first thing I would imagine going through your mind is, why are you talking about that? If that won't even happen till an election in November, and it won't happen that she would be Speaker of the House till January. Yes, but I think it helps people understand the bigger issue. So often we have people calling into this program saying, look, I just vote for the person. And I say, good, I'm glad you vote for the person because I want you to vote for a person you agree with, but you cannot ignore the party that person is part of. And I'll tell you right now that if you elect an individual that is a incumbent, re-elect an incumbent, or you even more so elect an individual that is a challenger who would be a first-year member of Congress, he or she will have no power and have no inclination to challenge anything that Nancy Pelosi, Jim Clyburn, Steny Hoyer, and others would want to do in the House of Representatives. So again, it's important to recognize that that is the case. So you again also have to recognize that, as he points out, some of those anti-Pelosi voices might not be intractable. Danny O'Connor, in the House Democratic candidate, and he says here, who appears to have lost. Now, he did lose. And that was the special election in Ohio. Also points out an individual that indeed some of those even that said they might vote against her not even going to be there anyway, because now we see that that election has now finally been called in Ohio. So again, finally, Jim Garrity says, based on past precedent and tradition, Pelosi just needs more than half of the caucus to vote for her. Almost everyone falls in line for their party's nominees in the full chamber. If there are 228 House Democrats in January, Pelosi needs 115 of them to support her. Theoretically, even if 11 House Democrats felt particularly intransigent about Pelosi, they could vote with the Republicans to make the GOP, the Republican, pick the next speaker, most likely Kevin McCarthy. But that unlikely scenario would be one of the most epic betrayals in recent history. Democrats finally win back the House and then have about a dozen members that keep Republicans in charge. Not likely. So again, could House Democrats unite those 51 or so rebels and win over many of the other current pro-Pelosi Democrats? Sure, but it's an exceptionally tall order. If a Democrat isn't abandoning Pelosi now on the campaign trail and taking flack for the association from a Republican rival, why would he or she abandon her after the election? Backing Pelosi right now means you probably get rewarded for the loyalty if she becomes Speaker. If she doesn't become Speaker, you all took flack for nothing. So anyway, that I think helps us understand two things. Number one, if the election were held today and if the estimates are held today, looking at individual seats, it is quite possible that Democrats might get not just 218, but maybe as many as 228 seats. That would be 10 more than necessary. And even if you do believe that all 57 of those House Democrats who are either incumbents or challengers are reelected, that's not enough to be a challenge for her. So unless something remarkable takes place between now and then, when she would be elected as Speaker of the House, the assumption is if Democrats take the House, Nancy Pelosi is the Speaker, and that same day, proceedings for the impeachment of the president probably would take place. So that's just a little bit of a look ahead, and we're going to come back and spend some time talking with Jack Alexander, who's been with us before. So we talked about his earlier book, The God Guarantee. This one's called The God Impulse. And again, if you would like to find some of these articles, they're available at the website, pointofview.net. And also my commentary today is about how a majority of Democrats, 57%, view socialism more favorably than capitalism. First time in history, and that itself might tell us a little bit about how the vote takes place in the midterms. So those articles and that commentary are available on the website, pointofview.net. I hope you'll take the time to kind of read those and evaluate those, especially some of those questions for Judge Kavanaugh. Next week, we're going to hear a lot of hue and cry and a lot of controversy surrounding the confirmation hearings for him as the next Supreme Court Justice. We'll take a break, come back with Jack Alexander right after this.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate two replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. This hour we're going to spend some time talking about mercy. And you might say, boy, that's a topic we don't talk about very often. That's why we're focusing some time and attention on it today in this new book, The God Impulse, The Power of Mercy in an Unmerciful World. And it looks at the disposition of mercy, the discovery of mercy, the displacement of mercy, and the discipline of mercy. And the individual is an individual that has not only written about this, but more recently, we've also had a chance to talk with Jack Alexander about his book, God Guarantee. Matter of fact, if you want to hear that interview, it's September of last year, and it is still available. And you might want to listen to the entire interview there, where we talked about some of these financial issues. He's a businessman, an entrepreneur, theology student, a regular speaker, coach, and advisor. And Jack Alexander, welcome back to Point of View.
Kerby, great to be with you again.
Let's, if we can, talk about how people don't hear the word mercy very often, because, first of all, this book endorsed by all sorts of our friends like Tim Keller and Andy Stanley and Chip Ingram and Crawford Loritz and Michael Yosef, who was on with us just the other day, as well as just all sorts of other individuals that we have certainly grown to respect. But one of the other individuals that we've interviewed in the past actually wrote a book on systematic theology. And interestingly enough, you started looking at how many times in a systematic theology, how many times in a sermon do we hear the word mercy? And the answer is very rare.
Yeah, it's very rare, Kerby, and that's the reason I wrote the book. I was actually personally doing a study on the Good Samaritan, as you know, that the expert in the law, when Jesus said which one was the neighbor, he said the one who showed mercy. So it was this whole set of process of what we call see, go, do, endure. The Samaritan did all of those, and yet reading in a systematic theology book is a 1,207-page book, and it had one paragraph on mercy, and then we moved on to another book called A Summary of Christian Doctrine, and in a 184-page book, it had one sentence on mercy. So, you know, as a business person, we spot sort of imbalances. So I've spent the last 2 years working on this, and it's definitely, next week I'm giving a talk, and basically the topic they gave me, they called it the mysterious disappearance of mercy. So I think that's what's happened.
Well, and again, can you maybe give us an explanation as to why? I mean, after all, this is something we do talk about occasionally in the popular culture, and we certainly have very good reason in the scriptures to focus on that. But why has that seemingly disappeared, do you think, in the 21st century?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons, but Barna, I hired them as part of my doing this book to do a national survey. And Kerby, they found that 83% of Christians think it's not their personal responsibility to show mercy or compassion. So it's what in my book I call the outsourcing of compassion. We outsource so many other things, but in this case, we've got over 4 out of 5 Christians who say it's the job of the church, it's the job of 1.6 million nonprofits, it's the job of the government, but it's not our job. And I feel like in doing so, we're not really reflecting the character of God.
Well said. Again, the outsourcing of mercy and the idea that, I send, of course, we talked about this before with your book, God Guarantee. I send my money to your nonprofit, and you're going to dispense mercy to the homeless, to those in prison, to individuals that have a crisis pregnancy center, whatever it might be. But it's not necessarily something that I do, which brings us back to the parable of the Good Samaritan. And again, you have to recognize that Jesus was really using something that was pretty striking. But today we forget how a Samaritan was justified. So one of the things I love is you tried to update it a little bit and put it in a context and said, imagine a conservative Christian is robbed, beaten, and left for dead. His Bible lays by his side. Maybe he's wearing a ripped T-shirt supporting a local Republican candidate or proclaiming opposition to same-sex marriage. There's no question of who the man is and what he stands for. Who comes to his rescue? A man leaving a local pride rally carrying a rainbow flag, wearing a dress. The man stoops down, bandages the Christian's wounds, puts the man's arm around his own shoulders, carries him inside to safety, promising to care for him until he recovers. It's the kind, you're really trying to help us understand that today the word Samaritan doesn't mean what it did in that day, but Jesus is trying to point out that you have individuals who call themselves religious people, Pharisees, Sadducees, others, but it was the Samaritan who showed good work, and it illustrates again that he was really trying to get their attention and recognize how far short they'd really fallen from what God's intent was.
Yeah, I mean, we are in a crisis today. Microsoft did a survey last year, Kerby, and it said the average human attention span is now 8 seconds.
Yes, okay.
And goldfish have a 9-second attention span. And when you think about Jesus, Matthew 9 says, and everywhere he went, he preached and he healed. Well, that's truth, and that's mercy. And then he sent out his followers, and he said, I want you to preach, and I want you to heal. So people were amazed by Jesus because he had this combination of truth and mercy, and truth always brings hope, and mercy always brings healing. And so basically what's happened, I think, in our society is conservative churches have this appropriate high view of truth, but this lower sort of almost outsourced view of mercy, and liberals and others have a high view of mercy and a lower view of truth. And I literally see what's happening in our society every day, and you can just feel it, that mercy and truth are fighting each other.
Right.
And Psalm 85:10 says, when mercy and truth meet, righteousness and peace kiss. And that's the world. Those are the relationships we all want to have. But this, what Barna called this under-indexing of mercy, I think has really thrown the witness of the church and thrown our society into a bit of a crisis, I believe.
And you said something in passing I wanted to come back to just for a minute, because it was one of the things that's arresting even in the foreword that is written. And, of course, you bring it up later on in 8 Seconds to See, because in this society where we have so much social media distraction, and I'm going to borrow this in some of the teaching I do sometimes on social media, the assumptions that we've made over the years are that goldfish have, about a 9-second attention span. In other words, a goldfish swims around. Next time it swims around, it doesn't even remember what it did the last lap. But they now have assumed that we basically have an attention span of 8 seconds. So goldfish have a greater attention span. And then, of course, as your forward mentions, we're also dumber than sheep. We'll come back to that in just a minute. But it just shows you that in this fast-paced, microwave, frenetic lifestyle that we have right now, we're not really focused. So we don't have a good attention span. We don't have a great deal of concentration. In some respects, we're dumber than sheep. And we're going to talk about what to do to counteract some of that. So if you'd like to join us along the way, certainly we'll open up the phones in just a minute. And that is to have our conversation today with Jack Alexander. The book is entitled The God Impulse. It is published by Baker, and it's about 230 pages. We have information about him and the book on our website. We'll come back and talk more about bringing truth and mercy together and how to do that and how to accomplish that right after these messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A recent Gallup poll shows that a majority of Democrats view socialism favorably compared to a new low of Democrats who view capitalism favorably. To put this in perspective, just a few years ago, a majority of Democrats viewed capitalism favorably. Meanwhile, more than 7 in 10 of Republicans have had a favorable view of capitalism during that same period of time. The Gallup poll was quick to acknowledge that their poll does not define socialism or capitalism. As I've mentioned in previous commentaries and even in my latest book, Christians in Economics, this might explain some of the lower percentages. The term capitalism has often been degraded in the popular culture. The Gallup poll also believes that it is possible that a drop in Democrats' positive views of capitalism is related to Donald Trump's presidency. After all, Trump has been described as a free market capitalist. If you dislike Trump, then you're likely to also dislike capitalism. One last reason for the change can be linked to the prominence of socialists within the Democrat Party. Senator Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have been traveling the country speaking to crowds and endorsing candidates. Some of the proposals by Sanders that used to be on the margin of the Democratic Party are now becoming mainstream. Democratic socialists like to point to Sweden and Denmark as socialist success stories, but these countries are not technically socialist. And as I've discussed in previous commentaries, the success of these countries depended on a capitalist foundation long before the significant expansion of social programs. The Gallup poll announced that this was the first time Democrats viewed socialism more favorably than capitalism. This will affect how they vote in these midterm elections. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking with Jack Alexander today. His book is entitled The God Impulse, The Power of Mercy in an Unmerciful World. About 230 pages, published by Baker Book. And as we were talking about, with this 8-second attention span, sometimes you need something that sort of breaks through that. And one very poignant example of mercy you might remember from a number of years ago, where you had Charles Roberts that went and shot 10 young Amish girls. And in the midst of that, you could see all sorts of reasons why the Amish parents would be unwilling to forgive, but they did. And more than just forgive, even attended the funeral of this individual who later committed suicide after shooting the girls. And it seems to me, Jack, sometimes in the midst of the humdrum busyness of our lives, the lack of focus because of the busyness of our technology and the conflicts that we have to address every day, a story like that sort of breaks through and gives us probably a very vivid contemporary example of mercy, doesn't it?
Yeah, it sure does, Kerby. There's another story in the book about this guy who was a member of the KKK, and he was getting beaten to death, and an African-American woman went and basically laid her body on top of his and saved his life. And then that man ended up having a son who ended up carrying the picture of that African-American woman around in his wallet, and ended up meeting her and saying that he probably wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for her. So it's this idea that our enemies are not flesh and blood. You know, people who are lost, they don't have the truth, they don't understand, and that there's that old saying that people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And I think that mercy is literally, there's a power to it. And Jesus never outsourced anything. He went to the leper and touched him. He went to the blind man, put mud in his eyes. He went through Samaria out of his way to tell a woman about living water. He went to the cross. And so we follow a Savior who didn't outsource any compassion, and he's our model. And so the fact that we've fallen so far in terms of demonstrating it, because it's always messy and it's always costly. But if I'd have the radio listeners remember one thing, we've lost touch of the rewards of mercy. There are probably more rewards and more promises that come from living a generous life than anything else.
Well, and we see that in the Sermon on the Mount, poor in spirit, and talks about the poor and children and servants and slaves, and you go through that in some detail to remind us of the benefits of mercy and all of the rest. And yet, again, one place where we should feel mercy is towards the poor and distressed. And you talk about that in the book as well, don't you?
Yeah, well, there's a ton of scriptures, obviously, that talk about the poor and victims. And one thing Barna found, Kerby, is by a factor of 10 to 1, people will help the poor or a victim rather than someone who's in prison, for example.
Right.
Or somebody who's an enemy who's sinned against you. It's a 5 to 1 ratio there. So I think the world cares about hurricane victims. The world cares about the poor. But when we actually are merciful and love lawbreakers, I think we really understand the gospel, because I broke the law of God, and that he redeemed me. He pursued me. So I think that the contemporary understanding of mercy is very much to help victims and the poor, which obviously is very close to the heart of God. I don't want to take one iota away from that. But where we differentiate ourselves is that mercy, that nobody is deserving of mercy, and that we can open our hearts to anyone.
Right. And again, it's we talk about mercy, we talk about grace, and that we are the recipients thereof. So we should be willing to go and also provide that to another, which gets into our section about go and be reconciled, because there is a sense in which sometimes we, though the recipients of God's grace, and if you want, even God's mercy, are needing to go and extend that to others. And so there's a disconnect there, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. But the God impulse is the first step of the see and feel. The Samaritan saw his beaten enemy and he felt compassion for him. But like you say, the second step is actually to go to someone.
Yeah.
And when we get close enough to someone, for example, the Samaritan got closer than the priest and the Levite, so he could find out that he was still alive. But the way I set it up in the book is this is a series of sort of like on-ramps and off-ramps. So you can see and feel, but just pray for someone and feel like God's not calling you to go. You can go, but call 911. You might not be the one to take them to the hospital or spend the night with them. So I think I always grew up thinking mercy was like a deed or a gift you had or something like that, as opposed to this pattern of love that God calls us all into, that may be all 4 steps to see, go, do, and endure, or it could just be the first for the second, or the first, second, and third.
Might even encourage you to write some of these down as we're going through that, because part 1, as we've mentioned, is see, that is the disposition of mercy. We've been talking about that. The moment we're talking about part 2, which is go, the discovery of mercy. And then, of course, as he just mentioned, another one is do, the displacement of mercy. And then the final one, endure, the discipline of mercy. And that's a good point, because I think some people listening right now say, there's not much I can do. I'm bound, I'm disabled, I work 60 hours a week. But I still want to extend mercy to others. Maybe I can't do anything more, and I don't mean to minimize this, but all I can do is pray, maybe give. That's still significant, and I want them to feel guilty because they can't go and do. In the next hour, we're going to be talking about missions, and I'm going to challenge individuals to go and do missions, if nothing else, short-term missions, and to recognize the opportunity to go and to proclaim the gospel. But some individuals are still extending mercy by other things that they're doing rather than actually binding up the wounds of that individual.
Yeah, I think in the book we have a lot of simple cases. So, for example, my wife and I have had people live in our home for 15 years. We had a woman who was, while she lived with us, she talked to 1,000 women who decided not to have abortions. And she lived in our basement, and she was there for 3 years. And, we never charged her rent. The last 3 people we've had were women who ended up getting engaged to be married while they lived in our basement. They come up and talk. So there's simple daily mercies. The scripture talks about the daily mercies we receive from God. So I think
Right.
It's small things sometimes that can mean a great deal to people.
Yes. And again, you've been talking about on-ramps and off-ramps, and one of the phrases you have in there is always be merciful until you get to the point that granting further mercy would not be merciful. Can you explain that?
Yeah, that's right. Again, the God impulse is to see and feel. That's the name of the book, which is the
Right.
first step. But we've all been in situations where somebody can be an abuser. You're enabling them. To show further mercy would not be loving. But again, what I've seen with evangelicals in particular, we're so truth-oriented that truth engages our mind, mercy engages our heart. And that's why Jesus, his offering to people of truth and mercy was an engaged mind and an engaged heart, which just had such incredible power.
And I appreciate that, too, because you do warn us that, sometimes make sure that you don't jump in unless you've gotten some kind of counsel from people that you trust. Don't watch out for codependency. My wife and I have tried to help some individuals that were like homeless or had just a lot of issues. And there's a point at which it can become almost all-consuming. And you begin to recognize that even if we can provide them with all sorts of resources and benefits and things like that, it's some of the prior decisions that they made that put them in their circumstances. And to use my favorite example, if government steps in, all government can do is give money. But if they don't know how to manage money, or they don't make good decisions, or they don't necessarily have a long-range plan, that is not going to be effective, because there are other issues, spiritual issues, psychological issues, social issues, family issues, addiction issues that sometimes are the reason they are where they are. And sometimes we have to back up a little bit and figure out what we can do to begin to help and do something that's going to help them rather than just completely keep them in a position of dependency. Don't you think?
Yeah, you're 100% right, Kerby. And I think we need to seek the Lord. We need to seek sometimes professional advice. Sometimes we need to get the advice of our spouse. But I think the tendency is to take sort of that corporate view of 1 strike, 2 strike, 3 strikes, you're out. And here we follow a Savior who says, forgive 70 times 7.
Yes.
So I think there's this tension there between being wise. And I love in the Les Miserables, I don't know how many of the listeners have ever seen the movie or the
Let me come back to that, because we're coming to a break, because you've got a great scene there. I want to come back to it, and we'll talk about Les Miserables and the God Impulse with Jack Alexander right after this.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands, and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151. and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Jack Alexander as we talk about mercy, the God impulse, the power of mercy in an unmerciful world. It is published by Baker. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we also have an opportunity for you to go to our website, pointofview.net. You're going to find some information about Jack Alexander, which takes you to the reimaginegroup.com, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. Of course, we also have a place for you to click on the book, and you can get it in paperback or Kindle. But, Jack, you were talking about Les Miserables. What a great illustration of mercy. You talk about it in the book, but explain that if you might.
Yeah, I think I've seen it maybe 5 times, and the protagonist, Jean Valjean, he was arrested and given, I think, 19 years in prison for stealing bread to feed some sick kids, and he gets out of prison, he can't get a job. A bishop puts him up for the night, and basically in the middle of the night, he gets up and steals this very valuable silverware. He's caught by the police, who bring him back to the bishop, and the bishop says he forgot the candlesticks. He forgot the most valuable thing. And before I really realized it was mercy, I noticed that every time I'd see it, the whole crowd would gasp.
Yes.
It would be like, this is unbelievable that somebody would do that. And what very few people remember is what the bishop then whispers in Valjean's ear, where he says, "Tonight I have bought your soul for God." And that when someone's really done something bad, that somehow God, in that picture, we see that the value of someone's soul is so much greater than whatever they might have done. And somehow I call it divine mercy in the book, of where we actually move into the point of the divine when we look at the value of someone's soul. And I think sometimes that's the only way we can forgive. Kerby, something that the radio listeners might be interested to know is that Barna found that 25% of Christians have somebody they can't forgive in their life. So this would be a wonderful opportunity for your radio listeners to just go before the Lord and pray and just look at the value of someone's soul compared to whatever offense they might have done.
As I've said so often, we know even from secular psychological research that forgiveness is good for you. Even if you say, for no other reason than for my own mental health, forgiving and removing that burden of bitterness is worth everything that you can possibly do. And like you say, a very significant percentage of born-again Christians who have been forgiven of their sin nevertheless cannot forgive someone else. And I'm not minimizing that. We talk about sexual abuse on this program. We've talked about dysfunctional homes. I mean, I can understand why people would hold that. But, Jack, it's just a good illustration of the need for many of our listeners right now, even as we are talking about this issue of mercy and its related issue of forgiveness, to actually exercise that. So thank you so very much.
Sometimes to forgive themselves as well, because that's the unique thing I found about in the study of mercy, is that mercy is for perpetrators as well as victims. I think that I sort of grew up with a belief system that we give mercy to victims, and God's heart is close to the brokenhearted. God, if you're brokenhearted right now, God loves you so much. But this whole idea that we all realize that we are perpetrators, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and that God pursued us, God loved us, and that's the thing that makes Christianity different than any other religion in the world. Is we've got a God who became a sacrifice for us instead of us having to sacrifice to Him.
Wonderful. Again, the book is entitled The God Impulse, The Power of Mercy in an Unmerciful World. It's published by Baker. The author is Jack Alexander. We've been talking about see and go. And just before we leave the idea of go, you also have a section here which you call a price paid. And we don't always feel merciful. And that gets into a question, do I discipline or do I hug? And even the whole issue of pardon and the rest. Can you sort that out? Because once you've studied the issue of mercy, it raises some other questions about when do I extend mercy? How do I do so? Can you give us some guidance there?
Yeah, I think it's something, again, we need to pray over, but a verse that just stopped me in my tracks, Kerby, years ago when somebody had stolen from me was it's actually to our glory to overlook a matter. There's a Proverbs that says that. And that person continued to stay with my company, and we disciplined them, and but we still continue to give them opportunities. So I think that anybody who's a parent knows that sometimes you hug and sometimes you discipline, and I think that we need to ask God for incredible wisdom in that case.
Well, and you've seen some on the other situation where you've had individuals come to you, and when you take over a company, all of a sudden you didn't do anything wrong, but nevertheless you have that responsibility. So you've seen it go both ways, haven't you?
Yeah, I have. I mean, I told a story in the book one time. I did a closing, and we did something sort of on the side that me and two other people benefited from. And I went to my boss and I said, I got carried away. I mishandled this, and I wanted you to know about that. And he got a big smile on his face. He says, Jack, I'm so glad that you came to me and told me that. And he was incredibly merciful. So I'm one who's received mercy as well as granted it.
Well said. Let's go on, because we've talked about two aspects: C, the disposition of mercy; go, the discovery of mercy; now do, the displacement of mercy. And this is where, in some respects, we are picking up again with the Good Samaritan who went to him, bound up his wounds, poured oil and wine on him, put him on his own animal, took him to an inn, took care of him, even said to the innkeeper that I will pay you and meet those needs. Again, that's where, in a sense, mercy gets some shoe leather, and mercy begins to get some feet and walk through life, right?
Yeah, and again, it's in the context of doing it for an enemy. And in that case also, the Samaritan actually spent the night with his enemy. So imagine finding somebody beaten who's your enemy, and you not only do all those things you mentioned, but you actually stay up with him and maybe have a cold towel and wiping his head and making sure he's alive. And so again, this is a picture of God's love for each of us. And Jesus said that really everybody's our neighbor, because he set it up and set the story up in such a way where it's an enemy. And so if we do this for our enemies, certainly would do it for our family, certainly would do it for our friends. But the extent to which mercy and love goes, I call it the pattern of love, the seek, go, do, endure in the book, and that this doing is where we become a servant and we consider the other person more important than ourselves, and that it's where the love of Christ really comes alive.
Well, and again, some of the examples that you use, we can talk about South Africa. One of my colleagues was just teaching in South Africa, which is a lot different now than it was, but even some of the conflict there and some of the other places where we are dealing with true enemies. It's hard for us to really talk about treating our enemies graciously, because fortunately our enemies are just people that are maybe mean to us on Facebook. But in some cases, some of the most poignant examples of mercy are indeed those examples, similar to those examples and the example that Jesus gives to us in the Scriptures.
Well, Kerby, Jesus said, I came for the sick. I didn't come for the well. And I think there's a difference between people with sick circumstances, like if I just got hit by a hurricane, I've got sick circumstances, as opposed to when you have a sick soul, we end up doing things. We end up breaking laws. We end up getting in prison. We end up sinning against people. And I think that I think those are the people that Jesus came for, that oftentimes we don't pay attention to, which ties into that 10-to-1 ratio we talked about earlier, that people want to help victims. But I think that the openness that people can have when they are a perpetrator, because it's like divine going to a prisoner, like you mentioned, the Amish, going to the funeral, embracing the mother. She went and then would do child care for the child of the woman, where we go the extra mile, and the world just is amazed the same way they were amazed with Jesus.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll spend just a few more minutes on endure, because these are the 4 points. See, go. Of course, we've talked about do and endure. And at the same time, we'll also encourage you to go to our website right now, pointofview.net, and you can click on the link to the reimaginegroup.com, or you can simply go to the reimaginegroup.com, and I want to talk about some of the resources there, not only for this book, The God Impulse, but for the God Guarantee, some of the things he's done in terms of reimagine generosity and reimagine stewardship, and so many great resources that are available at his website. So we'll continue our conversation with the book, and then also encourage you to go to the website. All that coming up right after these messages.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. The facts of Mary Ann Sauce's case are almost unbelievable. When the police visited her federally subsidized home one night investigating a noise complaint, they were clearly irritated. Their harassment and threats were so harsh that she feared she would be taken to jail. That's why she asked if she could pray silently while they finished their paperwork. When an officer returning to the apartment noticed her on her knees, he ordered her to stop, which would have probably been fine if the officer continued asking questions necessary to a police investigation. But he didn't. Instead, he continued to mock her and suggest not too subtly that she should move away from their small Kansas town. Mary Ann felt abused, so abused that she went to the library to research how to file a federal lawsuit. With a paper and pen, she hand-wrote a complaint that a federal judge later dismissed. First Liberty took on her appeal, and what started as a handwritten complaint ended at the Supreme Court of the United States. In a per curiam decision, the court granted Mary Ann's appeal, vacated the decisions below, and remanded the case to the lower courts. As the justices explained in their opinion, there can be no doubt that the First Amendment protects the right to pray. Prayer unquestionably constitutes the exercise of religion. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. You can protect your religious freedom by going to firstliberty.org to download your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit. Our attorneys created kits for churches, ministries, Christian schools, military members, students, and teachers, and the workplace. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Jack Alexander as we talk about his book, The God Impulse, The Power of Mercy in an Unmerciful World. Looks at all sorts of great stories, illustration, biblical perspectives, as well as, of course, the Barna research behind all of this. But I thought we would focus at least a little bit of time, Jack, on the idea of endure. And one of the things that I thought would be helpful is this Hebrew word hesed. You know, when people talk about love, they talk about eros and agape and phileo. But there is that Hebrew word hesed, which could be translated mercy or loving kindness. But that appears, I think you say, 66 times in the Old Testament.
Times.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yep. Yeah, it's just this unbelievable, totally undeserved, and just inconceivably generous love of God towards us, that he pursues us. It's unconditional, and it's just that ability that I think God has, that he wants us to have to follow him and reach out to people the way he does.
Well, and again, one of the quotes you have from Johnny Hunt, today people want to define the gospel more than they want to live the gospel. And it kind of brings me back to one of the recommendations by Tim Keller, who's been on the program with us a number of times, where he says Jack draws a straight line from the lack of teaching and the unrepresentation of biblical mercy in the church to the lack of love so many feel from the church. And as we've said so often, sometimes you are the only Bible some people will read. Their assumption about what Christianity is and whether Christianity is true is how you live it out before them. And it seems to me that that's a very significant application of your book.
Yeah, I think one of the most discouraging books I've ever read before was Unchristian. It came out 10 years ago.
Yes.
Basically said that our market, the lost world, sees us as unloving and judgmental. And I remember reading that and thinking, that's our distinctive. Jesus said, a new commandment I give you, that you love one another. People will know that we're Christians by our love. And so for Tim to basically say that this lack of underrepresentation of mercy and under-teaching of mercy in the church, he could see a straight line between that and this condition, was one of the encouraging things in this journey.
Well, and again, how does this maybe connect up with your previous books, especially when you've talked about this idea of generosity and stewardship? Because you actually talk about Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and others, the giving pledge, and the various billionaires that have wanted to give. Now, very few of our listeners are even close to that category, but it does seem to me that mercy involves even this issue of generosity and stewardship, whether it's the stewardship of your money or your stewardship of your time and your talents. Those are all very important issues if we're going to really be involved in not only doing but engaging the world around us.
Well, Kerby, I think that the merciful person is actually the most generous person in the world, because in my life, I've taken over 2 bankrupt companies and really 1 bankrupt ministry, and basically worked in each case for years to turn these things around. And one of the companies I bought, there were lawsuits that I had to assume.
Yes.
And basically all 3 of those did turn around, but it takes a real effort to get involved in messy situations. And again, because we're so busy today and we've got this 8-second attention span, I think we have a tendency to look at, oh, this is too messy, this is too costly, I'm not going to get involved. And on page 98 in my book, I give a list of 12 different things. I mean, it's life and health and future and your children and your career. And I think that we call it building a bridge in the book, that when we build a bridge for others, that God miraculously builds bridges for us, for our kids. I think I mentioned to you in the earlier show, my wife and I have helped 3,000 widows in India for the last 10 years. And we had a grandson born with a significant issue. And they had postcards around the state of India that these widows started praying for Samuel. And he still has some significant issues today, but it's been a miracle what's happened in his life. And it's like, in a way, God used my wife and I to build a bridge for them, but then I can just cry. In a way, God, these widows built a bridge for Samuel.
Yes.
And I'm convinced that when we take steps to show mercy, that it's an investment. It's not a loss. It's not a write-off. It's not time wasted. But I think for 40 years, probably being a Christian, I thought, well, mercy is a deed you do. You help the poor, you help these victims, and then that's it. But I think it's so much deeper than that.
Yes. Well, and you end the program, but also end the book with Psalm 85, when mercy and truth are met together, righteousness and peace have kissed each other. And so you talk about see, go, do, endure, then watch for the kisses and listen for the gasps. Of course, the gasps go all the way back to the very significant experience there with Les Miserables. And so just before we run out of time, let's, if we can, mention your website, because we've encouraged people to go to the reimaginegroup.com. That's where they can, of course, get a copy of the book, The God Impulse, but also find some of the material that you have there of the God Guarantee and even the idea of reimagine generosity, reimagine stewardship. So what is available to our listeners as they land at your website?
Yeah, I would encourage them also to go to theGodImpulse.com. We've got free study guides and bonuses that can be very helpful. It can be your family might want to do a study on this, or a group of friends in your church or something like that. But I think it's a rich study, and when you think about the Ark of the Covenant, that the truth was in the covenant, but the mercy seat sat above it. I just think that God has such a high view of mercy, and I think it's been lost today, and I think we're in a mercy crisis, Kerby.
I think so, and I know why you wrote the book, why you actually got our friends at Barna Research to pull some of that together. And like you, when I read Unchristian and saw that the perception is that Christians are too political, they're hypocritical, they're unloving, they're anti-LGBT, they're anti-science. I mean, that's not exactly the way you want to be known. So again, maybe this, as well as many other books and programs, would be helpful. And of course, if you go to the link that we have there, it'll also take you to the God Impulse, and you will find that there are all sorts of bonus offerings as well, and some material that you can use in your study. So again, let me encourage you to look for it in your local bookstore. If not, we have links so that you can get a copy of the God Impulse and use it either in your own individual study, or maybe this would be an excellent small group study to begin to once again refocus time and attention on mercy. Jack Alexander, thank you for writing this book, and thank you for giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. God bless you.
When we come back, we're going to spend some time talking with Kurt Nelson, who is the president and chief executive officer for East-West Ministries. We're also going to be talking by phone with Steve Smith. They've been on the program with us before. We've had a number of people from East-West with us. John Mazel, Mario Zonstra was there, and of course he's moved on to another ministry, and Kurt Nelson is the head of East-West, and so we want to challenge you to consider what you might do to be a missionary in your community, in other countries around the world. Short-term missions is a great opportunity for you, maybe even full-time missions, and I think you're going to be really encouraged by hearing some of these stories. So again, you can find out more about each one of these interviews today on our website, pointofview.net. As you go there, don't forget that my Viewpoints commentary is there for your viewing as well, and you can also sign up to receive it in your inbox. We send out my commentaries Monday through Friday, Penedectors on Saturday, and so if you haven't done that, that's another opportunity. And so all of this is available at our website, pointofview.net. We're going to take a break, come back with a variety of individuals, including Kurt Nelson and Steve Smith, right after these important messages.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate two replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do. in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us today. We're going to be talking about missions. I think this is going to be really encouraging to you, and to recognize that because of the advent of technology and some of these open doors, that you can be even involved in short-term missions. Perhaps you'd even want to be a full-time missionary. And most importantly, I hope you'll support this organization as well. In studio with us is, first of all, the president and CEO of East-West Ministries. Kurt Nelson's been on the program with us before. Used to be the vice president of Global Missions Fellowship, which is another organization I think so highly of, now called E3 Partners, a graduate of the University of North Carolina, also with degrees from Dallas Theological Seminary and a doctor of ministry degree from Columbia International University. Been with this organization for more than 2 decades. So thank you for being in studio with us today.
Thank you, Kerby. It's great to be back.
Might even encourage you to watch the program, and again, it'll be available later also on our YouTube channel right now. For those of you watching, you can also watch it on Facebook Live if you want to leave a comment. That's the case. And we'll open up the phones a little bit later, because I suspect some of you might have some comments or questions. And in just a minute, we're also going to be talking with Dr. Steve Smith, who leads a global coalition and is halftime with interestingly enough, East-West Ministries and with Beyond, which has also been in the studio with us as well, author of a number of books. We'll do a formal introduction to him in just a minute. But for listeners that don't remember the last time you were on, let's talk about East-West Ministries. We've had John Mazel on this program and others, but this is such an incredible ministry that you've put together. Talk about what you're doing.
Well, thank you. Our focus is on reaching the least reached people in the entire world. Approximately 3 billion people on planet Earth have never had the opportunity to first hear about Jesus and the grace of God and the gospel. It's hard to believe. 3 billion out of about 7.5 billion, so about 40% of the world's population have never heard for the first time. So our focus is to glorify God by multiplying followers of Jesus in the spiritually darkest areas of the world.
And you have been so involved in planting these churches, because a lot of people say, well, an individual here, an individual there. But again, you are actually able to, and you've got those numbers there, of the number of churches, individuals that come to know the Lord, and number of churches you've planted. Give us a sense of the extent of what you've been able to accomplish so far.
Well, what we've learned is really what the Holy Spirit did. I think the world first became aware of what we call church planting and church planting movements when all the Western missionaries were kicked out of China in the 1940s.
Right.
Maybe 3 to 4 million believers at that time. All the missionaries are out probably for at least 40 years. And when China began to reopen to missionaries, we discovered there may have been as many as 60 million Christians 40 years later without Western missionaries.
Right.
And what had happened was the church had literally mushroomed underground.
Yes.
Through people meeting in homes, much as they did in the first century church. And a house church is much harder to identify and therefore much harder to persecute than a visible church that has a building, a steeple, stained glass windows, etc. So we see God doing that in these spiritually dark areas all over the world. And we're just trying to pour fuel on the fire of what the Spirit of God is doing.
And I might just mention, as we've talked about before with those of you from East-West Ministries and even with E3 Ministries, we can't always identify the country, but we certainly can tell the stories. And I got a feeling now we're going to have a chance to talk to a great storyteller because now we've been able to connect up with Dr. Steve Smith, leads a global coalition to really reach the unreached people, author of a number of books, which is T42, which is, again, a discipleship revolution. Revolution, and also No Place Left Saga, Hasting, and also Rebirth. And he's been with IMB for 18 years and now is kind of halftime with you and beyond. And I've had both these ministries in studio with us. And Steve Smith, welcome to Point of View.
Thanks so much, Kerby. I appreciate it. It's great to be here.
Well, tell us some more of your background. We have had Kurt Nelson and John Mazel and others on the program. You're a new face and a new voice to us, so tell us a little bit more so we can get to know you better and hear some of the stories that I know you want to share with us.
Well, sure. I think for many years, my wife and I, when we were church planters in Los Angeles, we just knew that by the power of the Spirit, we should be seeing something much more like Acts happening. I mean, when you tackle a city of 13, 14 million people in LA, you just realize, even with the number of churches there, it's an impossible task from a human perspective. And so we were trying to do things in a very reproducible way, but it wasn't until our family moved to a limited access country in East Asia, and we were starting to tackle at that time what was the largest people group that no one was targeting. And when I say people group, we're talking about an ethnic people group. They got their own language, their own customs, and so forth. And in this country, there were 450 of those unreached people groups that really were still unreached with the gospel. And many, many of them were unengaged. No one was on the ground actually trying to reach them. And I remember, Kerby, I would walk into the mountains as a fresh, wet behind the ears, worker trying to figure out how to reach these folks. And I remember going village after village, and I didn't have very good language, but I did know how to say, do you know Jesus? Or do you know about Jesus? And I would get responses like, what is a Jesus? Where do you find one of these things? Mm-hmm. Just zero awareness. And when I realized that, and then I began walking through the villages, and I would look at a valley and I would see 30 or 40 villages, and none of them was anyone trying to come and share the good news. And then we had, not just dozens, but hundreds of valleys like that in this mountainous region, and no one reaching out to any of them. And finally, I realized we had 5,000 of these villages that needed to be reached. And I remember I would pray, I would read the book of Acts every month, and I would just pray, God, you've done this before. My favorite verse was in Acts 19, verse 10, where Paul and his team had been laboring in the city of Ephesus, which was the capital of the Roman province of Asia. And it says that while Paul was training his disciples there in Ephesus, these guys were going out all over the province. And it says, in 2 years' time, everyone in the province of Asia heard the word of the Lord, both Jews and Greeks.
Amazing.
And when I heard that, I just said, God, you've done this before. You've got to do this again. And so we began to claim those types of precedents. We began to claim those types of promises and say, God, we've got to find a way to equip a brand new believer the moment he believes to do two things that the Bible teaches us are the basics of a disciple. When Jesus called Peter and Andrew and James and John to get out of that boat and come follow him, he just said, let's do two things, guys. Number one, follow me. And then number two, I'll make you become fishers of men. And I realized that was the most essential DNA of any Christ follower, is that we're completely sold out in love to Jesus. Whatever he says, we say yes.
Sure.
And second, we want this thing to go viral. And as we began to watch disciples become churches that were very simple, like Acts 2, and then to see these churches, every 6 months they would go and start new churches, we began to see this spread throughout valley after valley after valley. We realized that we were experiencing the book of Acts.
Let's take a break, and we'll come back and continue that conversation. Entrust to faithful men who will teach others also. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
recent Gallup poll shows that a majority of Democrats view socialism favorably compared to a new low of Democrats who view capitalism favorably. To put this in perspective, just a few years ago, a majority of Democrats viewed capitalism favorably. Meanwhile, more than 7 in 10 of Republicans have had a favorable view of capitalism during that same period of time. The Gallup poll was quick to acknowledge that their poll does not define socialism or capitalism. As I've mentioned in previous commentaries and even in my latest book, Christians in Economics, this might explain some of the lower percentages. The term capitalism has often been degraded in the popular culture. The Gallup poll also believes that it is possible that a drop in Democrats' positive views of capitalism is related to Donald Trump's presidency. After all, Trump has been described as a free market capitalist. If you dislike Trump, then you're likely to also dislike capitalism. One last reason for the change can be linked to the prominence of socialists within the Democrat Party. Senator Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have been traveling the country speaking to crowds and endorsing candidates. Some of the proposals by Sanders that used to be on the margin of the Democratic Party are now becoming mainstream. Democratic socialists like to point to Sweden and Denmark as socialist success stories, but these countries are not technically socialist. And as I've discussed in previous commentaries, the success of these countries depended on a capitalist foundation long before the significant expansion of social programs. The Gallup poll announced that this was the first time Democrats viewed socialism more favorably than capitalism. This will affect how they vote in these midterm elections. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with our friends from East-West Ministries, and Kurt Nelson with us, Dr. Steve Smith. I should say Dr. Kurt Nelson, too, Dr. Steve Smith. And, Steve, you got to finish that story. I had to go to one of those mandatory breaks, and so, we're talking about fishing and following, and everybody's wondering, what happened to all those villages in the valley? Tell the rest of the story.
Yep. Well, the interesting thing was we began to gather the leaders that were rising up from the many churches that were starting. We began to find out that every 6 months, churches were going out down the trails and starting new churches. This was their vision. They had a vision that in 3.5 years, there were 80 churches. They had 80 churches at this point, could reach all 5,000 villages. And then I began to probe among them. What I found were a couple of things. One, their love for Jesus and their heart to see his kingdom come overruled everything else in life. They were going through intense persecution, beatings, tortures, imprisonment, and so forth. But here's the thing that was very interesting, Kerby. We were teaching them about baptism. And I told them, when we baptize people, we ask typically several questions about their salvation. And so then we practiced baptizing in the room that we were in. And then I said, are there any questions that you guys have? And this old man in the back, a farmer, raised his hand very timidly, and he said, Brother Steve, I know you taught us 3 questions. Should we add a 4th question to the baptism? I said, of course, brother. What do you want to ask? He said, I want to ask, when they come into your house and drag you away and throw you in prison and threaten to kill you, will you still follow Jesus? And honestly, Kerby, when I heard that, I began to weep. And I said, these brothers and sisters, though they're young in their faith, they love Jesus. They found this treasure hidden in the field, and they've sold everything to buy that treasure. What I found was that was in 1999. At that time, I knew of only 8, maybe 10 of these what we call church planting movements around the world. As of this year, we're now tracking 652 of these types of movements on every continent. God is sweeping across the globe, and he's making this a standard way that he expects his workers to respond to the power of his Spirit. In fact, we're tracking 50 million believers in these 650 movements. And on average, each movement has about 75,000 members in its network. So God's doing something in this generation which you don't hear in the news. What we hear in the news is we hear about Muslim terrorist attacks and so forth. But what we don't hear is that more Muslims have come to Christ in this century than in the previous 14 centuries. What we don't hear is that many of the church planting movements that are rising up are coming from Muslims that are converting to Christ.
Right.
And they're taking the gospel into the hardest places.
Well, Kurt, let me come back to you because, of course, you've heard some of these stories, and I would recommend his book T42 and T4T, I should say, and I'll mention more about that in just a minute. But this is what you want to do, is mobilize the church here in America to do what a lot of these church planters around the world who've never even had a contact with you to do the same kind of thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. An unreached people group, of which there are about 6,700 globally, is a people group in which there are less than 2% evangelical believers among that people. Right. So there's not enough momentum among the small number of believers there to reach their own people without outside help. Part of what Steve's talking about, these church planting movements, the role of the Western missionary has changed and is changing. Mm-hmm. We're playing much more of a in the background support, serve, train, and equip role, and not really leading the work from the foreground. So it takes a lot of humility to go. It takes just a clear understanding of how missions is changing, and really what Steve talked about is a clear commitment to multiplication. About 150,000 people a day die, and at least half of those, if not more, have never heard the good news of Christ. And so we're not going to get there through addition methodologies. We're only going to get there if the strategies we engage have a multiplying effect.
Yes. Well, and Steve, let's talk about that, because I just, before I went to the break, talked about entrust to faithful men who teach others also. You can't get there by addition, but you can get there by multiplication. Explain that, if you might.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, what you were quoting from 2 Timothy 2:2, where Jesus, where Paul says that, the things that you've heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust these things to faithful or reliable men who can teach others also. And in that one verse, we see 4 generations of disciples. We see Paul speaking to his disciple Timothy, who wants to be working with these faithful men to train others also. And multiplication was always built into the core of discipleship. It's just that we didn't have the lenses on our glasses to see it at times. And multiplication is basically this, where when I see a new believer, what I see is not a potential disciple of Jesus or a new disciple of Jesus. What I see is a movement. I see that this brother or sister can be equipped in Mark 1:17 to follow Jesus and fish for men in a loving, Spirit-filled way. And then, if they're willing to surrender to the Spirit of God, then we'll equip them every step along the way to help them fulfill that purpose. And that's what I love about what we're doing in things like T4T, which is just called training for trainers. What we're doing is we're walking hand in hand with believers, usually younger believers, but sometimes pastors, sometimes denominational leaders, and helping them to begin changing practices from, I don't really know if I can trust that new believer over there, to saying, wow, I believe I could trust the Holy Spirit in their life if I coach them in the right way, give them the right biblical equipping. And then we're there along the way, week by week. When they fall, we have this saying: we keep failing forward. And man, I cannot tell you the number of times we've failed in any attempt we've done, but it's always because we're trying to keep moving the ball down the field and keep moving toward this becoming a movement where average believers, they don't know any better. This is what we do. I expect to go make disciples of my family and my neighbors. I expect to train them and start a church with them. I expect them to do the same thing with others. And when this happens, we begin to see normally a generational rate, anywhere from several weeks to maybe several months. And our generational rate in East Asia was 6 months, primarily because it was between planting and harvest, and then harvest and planting. That's when they had time to go out intensively to share the gospel.
Right. But, Kurt, it's interesting because you have a seminary degree, and a lot of us have some kind of Bible or seminary background. And in America, especially North America, it's kind of the idea almost have to have a seminary degree to pray in church, And we're recognizing what Steve's talking about here is that everybody should be equipped early on to be able to share their faith. And if they're entrusting these great spiritual truths to others who then entrust it to others, that's how we're going to reach the world, right?
Absolutely. And I think we are taught in our Western model that you have to have a certain degree of education or training,
right,
but almost before you do day one of ministry.
Yeah.
And, as Steve's referring to in the Gospels, the disciples from day one were taught two simple things: follow me and fish for men.
Yeah.
And so what we're seeing in these church planting movements is that we call it obedience-based discipleship. And we lay out the commands of Christ, and we expect, and they expect instant for.
Right. And if they fail, then they fail forward.
Exactly.
That's exactly the idea. We need to take a break. And when we come back, though, I wanted to spend some time talking about how our listeners can be involved with you. Because sometimes there's a tendency to say, isn't that wonderful what's happening over in those outreaches? And isn't it wonderful that some of these unreached people groups are maintaining all of this without any of our help here? And there's a tendency to say, I'll just pray for it, which is certainly the first step. I'm not minimizing prayer, but there's some other ways that people can get involved. So I'm going to encourage people right now to go to our website, pointofview.net, and you can click on that picture there of Kurt Nelson, and you will find that will then take you to eastwest.org. So load that up on your computer if you're near a computer. We're going to talk about how you can pray, give, and go, and what that might mean. And, of course, we have, for those of you in the Texas area, you have what's called North Texas Giving Day, and there's a way in which you can be involved with East-West. And so I hope that you will take the time to find out a little bit more about these particular organizations that we have been featuring, and especially today featuring East-West Ministries. Might mention Beyond Steve, since, of course, we've had them in studio with us as well, since you spend half your time with East-West and half your time with Beyond. When we come back, we're going to talk about how you can be involved. And so if you know somebody, for example, that might be interested in short-term missions, hey, maybe you should be interested in short-term missions. Or if you have your missions pastor that's not listening to this program right now, give them a call during the break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about ways in which you can be involved as an individual, way your small group or Sunday school class can be involved, or maybe even how your whole church can be involved. So we're going to give you some action items, and those will certainly be best facilitated by going to our website, pointofview.net, or go immediately to eastwest.org. We'll take a break, continue our conversation right after this.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands, and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Privileged to have Dr. Kurt Nelson in studio with us, Dr. Steve Smith with us as well. And if you'd like to join a conversation today, 1-800-351-1212. Just a minute, we're going to encourage you to go to the website, eastwest.org. But we've already got one call from the state of Maine. Bob, what is your question for us today?
Hi, thank you very much, Kerby. As a casual observer, it seems to me in the Chinese situation with the house churches, and maybe elsewhere, your guest could comment, that once the government lightens up a bit and they kind of come out from undercover a little bit, it seems to be a strategy that then shortly thereafter they crack down knowing where they are and knowing their modus operandi. So anyway, I just wonder what you folks think about that, if you've seen that elsewhere.
Certainly. Steve, let me come to you first. And also, I want to hear the rest of the story about what happened to all those villages. But any comments about that? You've been sort of watching the on-again, off-again persecution in places like China and other places around the world?
Yeah, that's pretty much a typical strategy from governments like the Chinese government, where they'll offer lax, provisions. If you want to be more open, we'll relax some of the conditions of what we were doing. And again, it's usually a ploy to find out where they are. That's happened in a number of other countries as well. So, but the cool thing is that these house church leaders they're in networks of connectedness. And so they know how to typically respond to these types of things. And they generally have people, even on the inside of the government, that can help them know this is a legitimate one, no, this is not. I would say, just for listeners, that the Chinese situation right now is probably the worst it's been since the Mao era.
Yes, that's what I've heard.
Bad.
Yes. You were telling us about these villages, and I wanted to finish your story, and we kind of moved on for a moment, but let's, if we can, tell the rest of the story.
Well, the very interesting thing was that these villages then became an example to other believers. In 1 Thessalonians 1, it says you became an example to all the others in Macedonia and Achaia. And so these villages where churches began to crop up, the first year there were 25 churches. Most of those, I would say 18 of those, were started by outside church planters that were Chinese ethnically or like a cousin people group. But 7 of those, actually that first year, were started by these new believers themselves. We were so encouraged. And then the next year, the number jumped from 25 to 76. And then the next year, it jumped from 76 to 175. And at that point, we realized what we had on our hands was truly a movement.
Yes.
And the way it felt was we were just hanging on by our fingernails. And this just began to go valley by valley. But what you also have to realize is that the key to any movement, for it to truly be healthy and for it to be sustained, is what you do in terms of leadership development. Leadership development is really the engine the Holy Spirit uses
I would agree.
to sustain
Yes.
the longevity of a movement. And that's why, but the problem is, again, remember I said in the beginning, all of our methods had to be something that were reproducible, that they could do themselves, that they didn't have to rely upon us as outsiders to come in and do. So we had to begin to figure out, how do we get the training out to the valleys? How do we help them gather other newer leaders and train them and triage the problems they've got and so forth? How do we help them do more advanced type of Bible teaching in their contexts? And as that began to happen, what we began to see is that the leaders of these various streams of the movement began to take ownership of the larger vision. And as they took ownership of the larger vision, they began to say, we want to reach all of this people group, and we want to reach all of the other people groups around us. And this is happening now in a number of places where we see a movement in one people group begin to cascade into other unreached people groups nearby.
Isn't that great?
And the reason is Acts 1:8. from day one, we're always asking the question, what expectations are we putting in the hearts and minds of these new believers? And from day one, we taught them, the fishing for men is an expectation, and we're not done until this has gone to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. And so they knew that was their role. And then they began to help spark some other movements and other people groups around there. And I think that movement became sort of an example, as I mentioned, as in 1 Thessalonians 1, that people began to look at that and say, wow, this is happening in my country. It can happen in my people group. It can happen in my city. You realize that this doesn't just happen in another country or among another superstar church planter or missionary. This can happen through ordinary people just like me. Sure. And I would say this, on average, in every church planting movement around the world, 99.9% of the people that are leading in these movements are lay leaders. They receive no pay. They have full-time jobs because this is just an expectation of their lifestyle. Their roles change, but their discipleship identification is always the same. I follow Jesus, I fish for men. And I love that. They don't expect to have anyone support them. They expect to do this because of their heart for God and what the vision is that's on God's heart.
And again, I might encourage some of you as listeners to write down, of course, Matthew 28. And, of course, we talked about Acts 1:8 and 1 Thessalonians 1 and a couple of passages we've mentioned here. Just before we run out of time, and I want to make sure I don't, we have encouraged people to go to the website. We have a link there to eastwest.org. And, Kurt, for just a few minutes, you have Pray, Give, and Go, how you can multiply followers of Jesus in these spiritually dark areas. And you also alluded to, you have like a Muslim initiative. I know you have a digital evangelism initiative. Talk about all the ways in which some of our listeners can get involved.
Great. As Kerby mentioned, we do have short-term mission trips, which is usually kind of the first level of people getting involved. They're typically 8 to 10 days. Some are in our hemisphere in I'd call it a closed Latin American country. You can guess.
Yes.
And then the rest are usually across around the world. But we're taking mission teams to at least 15 different countries every month of the year. Probably take about 1,200 people this year on these short-term mission experiences.
Excellent. Yeah.
They're evangelism focused, and we will train you. We'll handle everything from the logistics to the equipping and the training to go and share your faith and share the gospel. We have some that we call extreme teams, and these are in some of the Himalayan mountains across the border of a couple different countries. And those, you put a 40-pound backpack on your back, and you'll hike up and down the Himalayan mountains where people have never seen a Westerner,
right.
Probably never seen a light-skinned person, and certainly never heard of Jesus, like Steve's experience in East Asia. And those are for the young at heart and the strong at body, but you're able to encounter people who've just never heard.
Yeah.
So we'd love for anybody to look on our website, look at opportunities for short-term teams, which is on there, and just consider coming with us.
Let's talk about two things before we take a break. Number one, I know of individuals that said, I've never led anybody to the Lord. And I went with East-West, and I led all sorts of people to the Lord. And that was such an encouragement for me for the first time to see the fruit of my evangelistic experience. And then back to the story that Steve was telling just a minute ago, I had a friend that went into a community. They talked about Jesus, and at the end, the people said, well, which one of you are Jesus? So again, just talk about the fact that you're meeting and reaching people that have never heard the name Jesus Christ.
Yeah, it's really surprising. I mean, we actually have found this even in the Caribbean, in our hemisphere, that we've met people that have never heard the name Jesus.
Yeah.
And again, probably 3 billion people globally have never heard the name or have no association with who he was, what he did, and what he offers us in the gospel. And as far as not having experience, probably a lot of people that we take have never led someone to Christ. We will train you. We will equip you. What Steve is talking about happens really on day one in much of the world to a new believer. We will give you that equipping. And the great thing is we'll take you into a context where you'll see the Lord use you to actually lead people to Christ, and often more than a handful. And what we find as we're trying to multiply followers of Jesus, we want to multiply North Americans following and fishing. And so the people that we take, their lives are changed as well in terms of their confidence in communicating the gospel, and I would say as in terms of their obedience in communicating the gospel back here with friends, family, coworkers, etc.
Well, again, we have Kurt Nelson and Steve Smith with us. We're going to take a break. When we come back, let me give you a chance. If you have a question, maybe you would say, I'd like to sign up for one of these. What's that entail or something like that? Or maybe you have some comments or questions. Maybe you've participated in something like that before. We'll open up the phones for just a few minutes to give you a chance to join the conversation. 1-800-351-1212. Or just sit back and listen and be encouraged, especially to pray for this incredible outreach. We'll be back right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. The facts of Mary Ann Sauce's case are almost unbelievable. When the police visited her federally subsidized home one night investigating a noise complaint, they were clearly irritated. Their harassment and threats were so harsh that she feared she would be taken to jail. That's why she asked if she could pray silently while they finished their paperwork. When an officer returning to the apartment noticed her on her knees, he ordered her to stop, which would have probably been fine if the officer continued asking questions necessary to a police investigation. But he didn't. Instead, he continued to mock her and suggest not too subtly that she should move away from their small Kansas town. Mary Ann felt abused, so abused that she went to the library to research how to file a federal lawsuit. With a paper and pen, she hand-wrote a complaint that a federal judge later dismissed. First Liberty took on her appeal, and what started as a handwritten complaint ended at the Supreme Court of the United States. In a per curiam decision, the court granted Mary Ann's appeal, vacated the decisions below, and remanded the case to the lower courts. As the justices explained in their opinion, there can be no doubt that the First Amendment protects the right to pray. Prayer unquestionably constitutes the exercise of religion. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. You can protect your religious freedom by going to firstliberty.org to download your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit. Our attorneys created kits for churches, ministries, Christian schools, military members, students, and teachers, and the workplace. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Kurt Nelson with us for a few more minutes. We'll come back to Steve Smith as well. And I just wanted to come back and talk about all the options that people have. First of all, of course, pray, then give and go. And when we talk about that, it occurred to me, Steve and Kurt, there's some other opportunities. For example, I know you have a fall luncheon September 20th, and that's in the Dallas area for any of our Dallas listeners right now at Park City's Hilton Hotel, and then go to East-West and find out about that. But many of our listeners are not in the state of Texas, but you could actually provide one of your staff to speak at a missions conference or something like that. So talk about what those opportunities are, because I really want to begin to challenge the body of Christ to consider what they might be able to do And as many people as are listening to this, they could talk to their missions pastor, or maybe they're on a missions committee and say, boy, it would really be fun to get Steve Smith or Kurt Nelson or one of your staff to come and share what God is doing and how you can be involved in missions. Talk about that.
Yes, we have quite a few staff, resident missionaries here in Dallas and around the world who would be honored and glad to speak at missions conferences to help motivate others to get involved in the Great Commission. On our website, which you've mentioned, you can there's a link to pray, and you can sign up every 2 weeks. We'll send you very fresh, direct from the front lines prayer request.
Yes.
And go. Their short-term teams are listed on the website as well. Opportunities for long-term deployment. We're also sending missionaries for in East Asia. You can go teach at a university for a year or longer, and it's a kind of an entry-level opportunity. But we have people that are going long-term as well. And in mention to the giving opportunities,
yes,
probably the nearest term, really exciting opportunity, we have a matching gift that's been put up for September 20th. Here in Dallas, we call it North Texas Giving Day, but you can live anywhere in the world and participate. And all you would do is just go to www.eastwest.com/giving day.
Mm-hmm.
And any gift given on September 20th will be matched dollar for dollar up to a $250,000 matching grant. That's been put in place. So double your gift before it goes to work for the Great Commission.
That is incredible. Steve Smith, one of the things I encourage people to do is pray. And, of course, I've prayed for John Mazel because I knew he has a really significant health issue. But I just found out today you have one. So is it possible that we could be praying for you and your health as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I would really value that. I think while we were doing our missionary work in East Asia, I picked up a form of cancer that is very rare in the Western world, but it's very common. I say very common, more common in the Asian world, primarily because of the types of foods that you eat when you're out in remote areas. And so it's a cancer of the bile duct and liver. And so far, really, none of these strategies the doctors have used have really proved very effective. So we're sort of at the hopefully the clinical trial stage to see if there's something else that can work. And I would just encourage you guys. We've got this global coalition that East-West and Beyond help to lead. That's focused on trying to start CPM engagements in every unreached people group in place by the year 2025. There's huge momentum going toward that effort, and I am one of two guys that really helped to lead that effort. And I think it's no coincidence that months after we kicked this off is when we found out about this cancer. So I would just appreciate prayer, of course, for healing. But the bigger thing that we're praying is God heal or do something better. And we know that all throughout history, God's servants, sometimes they're delivered through life. Sometimes they're delivered in death. And this vision that God's given us propelled to the nations. So, yes, you can pray for that. And I would also just say, just as a by the way, Kerby, a lot of folks, that you've described that say, I've never led anyone to Jesus. The easiest way I've found to do that is just go watch someone. And over the last 6 years, one of the things that I've been doing in the States with a number of colleagues is just training people from different organizations, whether it's East-West or, IMB or Crusade, doesn't matter who they are, or just individuals or churches to know how to personally share the gospel, how to make disciples when they do, how to form groups that can become churches, and how to raise up leaders. And so if you want to just find someone in your state that's nearby that can take you with and actually walk you through this process of how to multiply disciples, not simply add disciples, I'd encourage you just to go to noplaceleft.net, noplaceleft.net. And at that website, you'll find people from all these different organizations that are just sharing their stories of how God's helping them to start movements or try to get a movement started in their state or in their city. So pray for me. And the biggest prayer I would say is pray for the fulfillment of this vision that God's really laid on our hearts.
Again, noplaceleft.net. We'll put that on the website here. And again, we've got that linked up, and you'll be able to find it a little bit later on the website. But, Kurt, just before we run out of time, let's again talk about all the opportunities. If somebody says, well, this would be great, but I just never led anybody to the Lord. I have no idea how to do that. I'm in North Carolina, or I'm in California, or I'm in Georgia, or I'm in Maine, as we got called just a minute ago. How can they begin to connect up with you?
So our website, eastwest.org, has got all the different avenues: pray, give, go, short-term teams. But I'll mention one more, and I'm glad you asked, Kerby. We're doing something that we call our diaspora ministry. Now, the original diaspora was when the early believers, after the resurrection, ascension of Christ, persecution came upon Jerusalem. Was that 90 A.D.?
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, the people, the Christ followers, the apostles, and the early believers were dispersed out of Jerusalem by persecution.
Yeah, 70 A.D. Yeah,
70
right.
A.D. Thank you. And so that was what we call the diaspora. Well, now there's like a reverse diaspora going on.
That's true.
Where the nations are coming here, usually for all kinds of different reasons. Some persecution, but other reasons. And so we're now doing something. We also call it Go Here. But we will come work with your church, work with your pastor, your community. We will train you, equip you to reach Muslims, to reach Hindus, to reach Buddhists, animists, atheists in your own community, and help you begin that local outreach among the nations in your neighborhood.
And so again, just before we run out of time, Steve Smith, let me encourage people to pray for you. And a final word about reaching the nations for Christ.
Yeah, I have a book that just came out called Spirit Walk. And this is what I've been observing, Kerby, over the last several years. As I've been training church planters, missionaries, national church leaders, is that many of them are so excited to get some of these simple tools in their hands to multiply disciples that they're running out the door to do these things, but they've never learned what Jesus said about wait until you're clothed with power from on high. And I wasn't raised in a church tradition that taught me how to be filled with the Spirit on a daily basis, how to walk in step with Him. But until we do that, our tools are just simply empty mechanics. And my encouragement is, over the last several years, I've been trying to preach and say, we have to have the tools for multiplication, but we also have to have the Spirit working in our lives.
Well said.
So I would just encourage people to go just to Amazon, look at Spirit Walk by Steve Smith, and it's just been here for us. One East-West missionary told me this, one of our diaspora guys. He told me this a few weeks ago. He said, Steve, this was this change I needed to make things begin to work.
Well, again, Spirit Walk, we've talked about that book, noplaceleft.net, and, of course, eastwest.org. Kurt, thank you for bringing Steve here, and thank you for spending some time today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby.
That's all we have for today, and if you find yourself saying, well, I need to find out a little bit more about everything we've talked about, it's all available at our website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Join us tomorrow right here on Point of View.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate two replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because